Hello and welcome to everyone out there in the Actual Tech Media audience. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. The topic is how to protect your Kubernetes data against ransomware. This event is presented in partnership with our friends at Kasten by Veeam. We've got a great event lined up for you here today. There's going to be some cool live demos, so make sure that you stay tuned for those. But before we get started, there's something that you need to know, or a few things you need to know about today's webinar. First off, I should mention my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the host today. As always, we want these events to be educational, and we encourage your questions. We know that many of you out there are struggling with, ransomware, data protection, maybe moving to Kubernetes or already have made that jump. We're going to have some polls here in just a minute. We want to get your feedback on those. But we also encourage your questions there in the questions pane of your audience console. I see many of you have already said hello, good afternoon, good evening, howdy. So I love to hear and see those comments. Thank you for those. We also want your technical questions on today's topic. We even have a best question prize to help further encourage those questions, maybe shake some questions loose. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But first, I want to call your attention there to the handouts tab. It's there that you'll find a link to a free Kubernetes training from Kasten. This is a really cool that you can do completely free, learn all about Kubernetes. There's the free Kasten K10 Kubernetes backup download right there is the second choice. And then finally, there's a PDF resource on the 5 best practices for Kubernetes data protection. So make sure that you check out those resources in the handouts tab. And then finally, at the end of the webinar on the live event, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card prize. Of course, if you're watching this after the fact, the prize drawing has already occurred. The drawing terms and conditions can be found right there in the handouts tab as well. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our $50 Amazon gift card for the best question on today's live event. That means you have to ask a question to be entered, and then, of course, meet the prize terms and conditions. All right, so with the housekeeping information there out of the way, I'm excited now to introduce you to today's expert presenter. Hopefully you've caught him on previous events. His presentations are always fantastic. Welcome, Mr. Michael Cade, Senior Technologist for Product Strategy at Kasten Veeam. Hey, Michael, it's great to have you back on.
Hey, David. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, before I hand it off to you, Michael, I know we've got some polls here for everyone out there in the audience. 3 polls specifically. We want to get your feedback. And the first question is an easy question. Hopefully, it's, are you using Kubernetes? Yes, in production. Yes, in test. Maybe you're evaluating and learning about Kubernetes still. No, or maybe you're not quite sure. So I'll give everyone a moment to respond here to the poll, and then I'll share the results, and you can kind of see how you stack up with hundreds of your peers who are on this webinar today. So answer away there in the questions pane, a simple yes or no. Shouldn't take too long to respond to, and then we'll see what those results are. And I'm curious to see the feedback on this. And Michael, when you've done other similar events like this, I don't want to skew the results, but kind of what have you been seeing out there in the industry?
Yeah, so over the last year, definitely we're seeing them numbers but we're evaluating test POC in production, definitely seeing the numbers grow, again, without leading the witness. But interesting that there's a few no's here, because that means that the ransomware topic has caught someone's ear, and that's why they're joining to hear more about that, which is quite interesting in itself, right? In that it's not necessarily the Kubernetes part of the talk that people are interested in, but how does the ransomware story fit when it comes to a different platform that maybe they're not so familiar with?
Absolutely. Yeah, so let me share the results on this. And if I add up yes in production, yes in test, that's 37% there. So almost 40% of the audience is using Kubernetes in some shape or form. The remainder of the audience is, perhaps evaluating or just haven't had the time yet to adopt it, or maybe haven't had a specific application need. So very interesting to see. Good results. Let's move on to the next poll question, poll 2 of 3 here, and that is, do you have a data protection project for Kubernetes? So for those folks out there who either have Kubernetes in place, or maybe they're evaluating Kubernetes right now, planning to implement it here soon, you need to be considering data protection, I'm sure, as part of any new Kubernetes implementation. Isn't that right, Michael?
Yeah, exactly that. And it depends really. Like there's a theme going around stateful workloads, but also the application that lives within Kubernetes, does it require access to like AWS RDS from the storage point of view, and everything in Kubernetes is stateless? How are you protecting that whole piece as well is another key area that we're definitely seeing in out there in the wild today. So yeah, interesting
Yeah,
numbers
good
there.
good point. More and more applications being used in Kubernetes are stateful, and so you got to protect not just the container but also that stateful data.
Yeah, exactly
All
that.
right. Well, let me share the results of this one. And yeah, it looks like 21% said yes, they have a data protection project for Kubernetes. 34% no, not yet, and 43% said not yet, but planning something perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months. So excellent results there. And then here's the last of 3 polls, and that is, have you ever been infected by ransomware? And this is a simple yes or no, and I'm curious to see the results on this one as well. I mean, just in the small town that I live in, I know our local fire department was infected with ransomware for multiple days. A friend of mine who is an eye doctor, his eye doctor practice was infected with ransomware just last week. So, and that's just in the small town, and I mean, you see it constantly on the evening news, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly that. It's definitely the topical trend at the moment, and not for good reason, right? Is around ransomware or
Right.
data security in general. Anyone getting access to data is always going to be a relatively bad thing. Interesting enough, like so, seeing some of these numbers come in, it's quite interesting. I'm happy that there's a trend towards one number in particular, one answer in particular, which is good. And that's not me saying it's a good thing for yes either. But also interesting that people that have been affected or infected by ransomware are also on. And hopefully we can give you some pointers, because ultimately the whole session today is, yes, it's focused on Kubernetes from a backup perspective and how we can prevent, or how can we prevent and remediate against ransomware attacks specifically for Kubernetes. But I think Kubernetes is a platform. I think you'll find the same remediation tasks, whether we're talking about bare metal, whether we're talking about virtual machines or cloud-based IaaS or other platforms as well. So I think that's an interesting take on the whole session, to be fair.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also wonder how many folks out there have been infected by ransomware, but just really don't want to admit it. I've just shared the results here, and 20% said yes, they have been infected with ransomware. 61% said no, and 17% said not sure, don't know. What do you think, Michael?
So I think it's super interesting. I'd love to sit down on a round table with those 8 people that have all been infected and hear their stories as to what happened. Did they have to spend a lot of money? Were they able to remediate using backups? Were they able to remediate using security software? And then the no, clearly you're here to hear about how do we prevent or how do we remediate from such a threat that's out there in the wild at the moment. And the not sure, that's also quite interesting in that you like, again, ransomware can sit quite stagnant in your file systems across your environment. Could be quite interesting for those people to have a chat with as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, great information. Thank you, everyone out there who shared your thoughts and feedback on the polls. And with that, Michael, take it away.
Good stuff. Thanks, David. So really the premise of the session, and you've heard this from David, is how to protect your Kubernetes data against ransomware. I'm Michael Cade. I'm a senior global technologist at Kasten by Veeam, focusing on our cloud native strategy and what we're doing in that part of the business. I'm always open on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc., to have these discussions. If you were one of those people that wants to have more of a conversation about this, then find me on there, and we can more than, in fact, feedback is kind of what makes us better armed for what's actually happening out there in the real world. So I'm constantly speaking to end users and prospects around that. So to get into a bit of an agenda about what we're going to touch on is I want to first cover a little bit around what is Kasten K10, just a couple of slides, and really where the focus is when it comes to data management. And then we'll get into the need for immutable backups. How can we help solve that or fix that with Kasten K10? Then a couple of demos and an in-depth demo where I'm actually going to infect some workloads and show you how to recover from that. And then share some resources at the end as well to further educate and help on the journey of being able to prevent and remediate your attack. So if we get into who are Kasten by Veeam? Ultimately, our focus is around day two data management challenges. So if you think about day two data management challenges in general, whether that be physical virtual cloud or cloud native, as in Kubernetes, really our first focus would be around backup and recovery. How can we get data from from production into B, into a backup location? How do we adhere to something like the 3-2-1 rule that I know I've spoken about before, which is 3 copies of your data on 2 different media types, and one of them being offsite? Now, we're particularly bothered about Kubernetes from a Kasten perspective. Obviously, the wider Veeam company has a portfolio of products to be able to deal with many other different areas and infrastructures and environments. So backup and recovery is always the first port of call. How can we be the most efficient, the fastest, and also how can we be the most fastest to recover that data in case there was a disaster or a failure scenario? Then secondly, we have our application mobility. And I believe that this will be one of the biggest features that Kasten K10 will deliver as more and more people adopt the Kubernetes technology. And what this allows us to do is freely move our stateful workloads or our workloads from one Kubernetes cluster to another. And that could also be something like OpenShift to Kubernetes, or Kubernetes to OpenShift, or manage Kubernetes back on premises, or the other way around. Being quite agnostic to that is K10's got the ability to, because there is software only, we're not tied into the storage layer that holds our data. In fact, we do quite the opposite in that we can help move data freely between those without really having a favorite way of or space to be storing that data. And then equally important is automated disaster recovery. So backup and recovery is one thing, and that'll settle a lot of the failure scenarios that we see in today's world, ransomware being one of those. But disaster recovery, that goes back to the complete outage, the really bad things that you can think of, whether it be natural disasters or whether it be also ransomware. If ransomware takes hold, and I'm going to show one of the examples in the demo, is if you were to have your cloud credentials compromised, what does that look like? What does DR look like at that point? Like, do you have a secondary cloud account that you can use that's not linked? Do you have a secondary cloud that you want to go to? What happens if the cloud goes down? But there's a lot of different failure scenarios as to, well, what happens to my business if I don't have availability. So automated disaster recovery gets its own bullet point here, because we want to give you that peace of mind to be able to automate the movement of that workload, that application, from one place to another. And then just drilling down on that a little bit further. So if we look at backup and restore, there's some key caveats that we have to think about when it comes to Kubernetes in general. And again, I've said this before on on the show or on out there is really Kubernetes is a platform. Kubernetes is a way in which we can deploy and host our applications, very much like the virtualization, very much like the cloud. And each of those have that requirement for backup and restore. There's no magic button or no magic platform that removes that requirement for data management. But in order for us to do it in the most efficient and fastest way, then we need to have certain characteristics to that. So things like multi-tenancy, the ability to use role-based access control, the ability to scale accordingly to whatever the cluster's requirements are. We've got customers that have 100 node clusters. We've got customers that have got 3 nodes. Like, how does K10 interact and work over those? And basically, we scale up as the cluster needs or the workload requirement requires us to. Performance, obviously, we need to lift and shift that data from A to B as fast as we possibly can, but whilst being as efficient as we possibly can as well. There's no point a backup running on the hour every hour if it's going to absolutely kneecap your environment. And then polyglot persistence is more of a term around being agnostic. I need to make sure that we can protect workloads, whether they live on privately, like on-premises Kubernetes clusters, whether they're using OpenShift, whether they're using Amazon EKS, etc. We need to be able to protect those and also be able to move workloads in between all of those different distributions that we have access to. Then disaster recovery in the middle. How can I be more prone to be able to recover my workload between availability zones and regions? How do I give the ability to manage multiple clouds in different regions, geos, etc.? And then how do I transform that? And that transform leads us into that application mobility, in that I need to be able to move that data because I'm going to have a much more frequent cluster upgrade cycle. Kubernetes releases 3 times a year. I want to make sure that I'm on the latest and greatest supported version. So I might want to make sure that I'm on that my application's also running there. Application mobility gives us one of those migration use cases to be able to move that workload freely between, as well as things like migrations between those different clouds. And that's where you'll see storage transforms in disaster recovery if we're going from one cloud to another, but also application transforms about changing anything that we absolutely want within our application so that it will run in whatever location it needs to. And it might be that another use case is being able to leverage that data. So being able to take advantage of maybe a public cloud's native services, in particular AWS, might have a tool that gives you the ability to take my database data, present that to a service within AWS, glean that information, get that information, then destroy that information without affecting our live environment at all. So being able to run test and dev, but also things like data mining type activity within that data. So 3 key areas of where Kasten K10 comes into play. So a lot of us will think that it's just backup and recovery, but there's obviously a whole load more things that go on behind the scenes there as well. Okay, so that's the K10 side of things. So now I want to get into the need for immutable backup. Now, you might think that we're going to instantly say, well, it's because of ransomware. Now, ransomware is probably the biggest and most topical topic to bring up, which is why the title of the session is that. But ultimately, there are other areas, and this, again, spans all of the different environments that we also touched on. So to get into what they are, the first one to talk about is accidental deletion. People do make mistakes, and we're going to drill down into that a little bit deeper. As well as having policy gaps. So, I think, especially as we have a much diverse team now, we potentially have DevOps-focused engineers, we probably have developers, and we probably have operations, and we probably have QA in there as well, and probably a few other different hats being worn by different IT teams. And it's because of that, then we see policy gaps. How do we know what's been configured? How do we know what the traditional backup job actually looks like and what is being protected? So there's a confusion around that. Then we've got internal security threats. Like we're constantly talking about ransomware, but What about malicious insiders? I'm going to touch on some of this because it's quite a scary fact as well. But there's also internal security threats that we have to consider, as well as the external security threats. And kind of this is where the ransomware really kicks in. But I kind of cross over that internal and external security threats in a later slide. But then also, why immutable backups? Well, the more and more we move down this data-focused era, there's more requirements around like legal and compliance issues, being able to make sure that you've got that data for X amount of time. Otherwise, you're going to get a hefty fine. Now, the only way you can absolutely be sure that you're going to have that data without it being compromised is by hitting that immutable flag and making sure that it's immutable on whatever storage that lands on, i.e. in the public cloud in AWS S3. So we're going to touch on some of those areas as well. So if we look at ransomware, the big picture, I've kind of touched on kind of a few, 5 of the bullet points around ransomware. But really, if we think about what it is in general across all environments, because really the platform doesn't really matter to these organizations that are attacking companies. They don't really care what access they gain. They don't care whether you're a Kubernetes customer or a Kubernetes user or a virtualization user or a cloud. Ultimately, they care because they want to get in. They either want your data or they want your money. Either one that's what they're going to hold you to ransom for. So it's spread in a particular way. And obviously, I'm not going to necessarily talk about the preventative tasks of this from a security company out in front of the out in the front line, like stopping things coming in, and a lot of things around education that I'll also touch on. But really, the fundamental piece of ransomware is that it's going to encrypt and it's going to hold ransom that data, whether that is data because they want to use that data to exploit something. And generally speaking, it's wanting you to pay money for the release of that data. And then it's a debatable answer whether they actually do give up that data and give it back anyway. Again, that's the leaking of the sensitive information. And they're using encryption methodologies. So if you think about, you might have heard red and blue team. If you think about the red team being the bad guys, they're the ones that are looking for loopholes, gaps, holes in your network perimeter that can gain access into your environment. You think about the blue team, hopefully everyone on the call is part of the blue team because we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to stop that from happening. And this might be the ethical hacker. It might be just the IT security team. But really, it's about how do we prevent any misuse or external security threat from that. So it makes sure that what we want to do as the blue team is make sure that all of our data is sound and secure, whereas the red team are trying to hunt down what that access control looks like, as well as what that data is and how they can use it. But now flipping back to actually Kubernetes focused malware, and we're going back to the beginning of 2021 at the moment. But again, we don't necessarily see in the news when X company has been attacked what the underpinning hardware is and what it's doing. So one of the particular ones though that we've seen quite a lot of is this particular malware called Hildegard, is where it's targeting cloud and container infrastructure and actually to mine cryptocurrency. So it might not be necessarily encrypting the data, but it is leveraging the CPU or it's using the CPU to gain folds in terms of being able to mine and add to a greater cryptocurrency mining operation. So it deploys malicious code or deploys code into a target, into the Docker daemon, and then off it goes. It runs as pods within your Kubernetes cluster. And just like that, if you don't have the correct observability on that, then you potentially you've got someone piggybacking on your potentially expensive spend if it's a managed cloud provider, and in which case, like you might never know about that if you haven't got the right preventative tasks already set up. But what it also does is because it lives in there, there's normally other sets of code in there that is going to sit in there and it's going to scan around the network, and it's going to try and understand day-to-day operations. It's going to try and get those important user credentials to get into other places, potential API keys to be able to exploit other areas. And then that's where the sensitive data comes, because cryptocurrency is great, but you have to mine it. But if I could just get some data and then encrypt that and then put a ransom to that, that's a much quicker way potentially to get some cash out of the situation. So I mentioned around insider threat and vulnerabilities. Now, this is when I first read about this, probably about 2 years ago. And again, this goes out to all environments. It doesn't just mean Kubernetes. But I'm highlighting it here because Kubernetes doesn't have a golden flag that stops any of this happening there as well. Because if you think about outsourcing network access, so we're talking about the red and the blue team, but we know that that's potentially not always a clean cut down the middle, because if you've got the ability to have certain access credentials inside your business, now we need to make sure that we have that audit log of who has access to what, because actually it's much easier if you can buy access into a customer. And if you went to some very well-known sites on the internet, you would be able to buy that for very little, or quite big as well for big names. But you can see there, $300 to $10,000, you're able to buy network access into a company on the internet. We're not even talking about dark web, the depths of the internet to find that information. And this could be things like just simple RDP access into your environment, or SSH. And then once they've got access, once the red team's there, then what else could they do? And if you think about like ransomware in general, is quite hard. You firstly have to find an entry point. You have to compromise user accounts. You might have to sit there and wait for a while for things to happen to see what happens, and then you're going to have to log that, and then you're going to have to get that information back somehow without being seen. And then you're going to find misconfigurations, vulnerability endpoints, etc., so you can gain access. Ransomware alone is a difficult and a job that some red teams actually obviously make money out of, organizations. So if you think about a disgruntled employee, then they're able to exploit that by potentially selling off access to your environment. Now, that is meant to maybe give you a little bit of a concern for your environments, and rightly so. We should be concerned because it is happening. But there is one more area as well, and this is kind of the light-hearted, but it happens. It happens regardless of what platform you're on. Now, I call this code 18 because it's 18 inches from the screen. And it's generally that user error. And generally, we can get around that, right? If that's a source control problem, we can quickly restore that. If that is a deletion of something like a Word document or something within our business, an email, we can generally get out of that. But what about deleting a database or dropping a database? How do we get out of that? And this is another reason why immutable backups really help, because you can't accidentally delete an immutable backup. Not you, not Amazon, not anyone out there. So that gives us an extra level of protection when it comes to accidental deletion. As users, we still make the most amount of damage within our infrastructures. I think the latest news that I heard on an analyst call was around 80% of 80% of outages were caused by accidental deletion, which I guess all of you could probably attest to that. But human errors are always bound to happen. Now, we make platforms that enable us to use code and repeatable tasks that remove the need for human interaction, but they're still there. Like you can see here from the bottom screenshot, if you can see that was someone accidentally deleting a namespace in Kubernetes. Now, we can put all of the desired state configuration that we want into Kubernetes to keep you up and running. But if someone goes along and runs that kubectl delete namespace, name of namespace, then it's gone. That is gone. Like there is no way of getting that back other than from from data protection. So, okay, I don't know if that's going to build out properly. But, yeah, there we go. So, from a preparedness, how can we be better prepared when it comes to these? And I've been saying it for the last few years, and the numbers keep on going up in them polls at the beginning, is how can we be more prepared? Because if it's going to happen, I'd rather know about it so that I can prepare for it and I can roll back as fast as possible, versus it being sprung on me and not knowing about it. So I say about better safe than sorry, right? We know that it's going to happen. It's inevitable. So what can we do to help prevent that? Well, one is let's make sure that everything is updated. And then also let's concentrate on our routine audit and security checks, making sure that the least privilege has access to our systems, so that it's not everyone. Not everyone's got God mode to be able to access their systems. And the other key thing is that it's all well and good, like everyone on the call is probably in an IT position, but what about the greater? What about the greater company? Yeah, 3-2-1 rule, important regardless of the platform. If you can adhere to that, then from an off-site point of view, it means that you've always got a copy of your data in an off-site location. So, worst case scenario, you go and find that off-site location, and you can then recover that workload into whatever environment needs to be recovered into. And another key part is, well, why are containers so vulnerable? Getting back to the cloud native world, is that generally speaking, unless you're, and this is a big issue around container images, is that over permissioning during the install and the operation. So not always supplying root access is not a good practice. We should be locking them systems right down so that we've only got the bare metal, the least required access. Not keeping things up to date. I mentioned right at the start around making sure that we're on a most up to date and supported version of Kubernetes, but then there's also different versions of databases and other data services, and then making sure that we have that gap from our backup point of view. How can we have that offsite copy? Again, just reiterating that this platform, Kubernetes containers, they're not magic.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah, it feels like there is a bit of lag here because I'm seeing myself on screen. So I'll keep going unless you tell me otherwise, David. So I think I've already kind of covered the need for immutability, but just to summarize what that looks like. So we've obviously got malicious actors, ransomware, and other attacks on our data. And again, it doesn't matter what platform that is. We've also got the requirement around governance and compliance and data retention, where it must be enforced. And we have that accidental data loss. People make mistakes. So they're the three key areas. And I mentioned another two with internal and external, and you could couple those in there. But immutable backups provide that extra layer of protection. So now we want to get into how does K10 uniquely approach this? So one is immutability, and I'm going to show you what that looks like shortly. One is also simplicity. I'm going to show that in the demo as well, how easy it is to just adopt and make it possible to use immutable object storage. Using policy-based automation, how do we incorporate so we don't have those policy gaps that I first mentioned, whilst also having the freedom of choice, so we're not locked into using particular storage or Kubernetes platforms. The other key area is the ability to have freedom of choice of where we're going to store that data. Now, I've mentioned a lot around AWS S3, but think about any S3 compatible storage as well that provides the ability to have immutable backups. Also, from a Veeam point of view, if you're sending your backups into a Veeam backup repository, the ability to leverage the repository types that are available there as well, whilst also being able to offer that multi-layered consistency. So whether you've got a database that needs to be application consistent, or whether you've got a whole application that needs to be consistent inside your cluster. Now, the key fundamental is around write once, read many, and that's definitely the way in which immutability kind of started. In how do we make sure that once we've written our data, we can read it as many times as we want, we can leverage that data, but we cannot write any more to that data. If we look at what we do from a backups point of view, and I'll show this part of the demo again, is that very simply, if you want immutability, it's a tick box. It doesn't cost any extra from our point of view. It may be a little bit more from an API cost to push and pull, or push and get rather, from the cloud provider, but really it's minimal for the benefits that you get. And you pre-configure the bucket as backup targets, and then when you go through that, we validate that the bucket is configured correctly with the correct amount of protection period on there that you wish. Also, the ability to leverage different retention modes, so whether that be governance, where you can override, but from a compliance point of view, that cannot be overridden. So compliance is the default way that we advise our customers to go, because even AWS, if you delete your AWS account, that data is still on those disks wherever they may be. And then also from an object retention. So again, the governance and compliance, whether we want to keep it for legal hold type environments where we might want to still update that data, but from a compliance point of view, you cannot touch it at all. Okay, I'm going to jump into the demo. So hopefully everyone's still with me. In this demo, we want to show you how easy it is to set up a new location profile with the new immutable backup functionality that came in Kasten version 4.0. So first of all, head on over to settings and then your location profiles. Add in your profile name. Choose the cloud provider that you're wishing to use, whether it's Amazon S3 or S3 compatible. In this instance, I'm using Amazon S3. Add in your access key and your secret, and then the region in which you've created your bucket, and then the bucket name that you wish to use. Now, this would be normal, as in if you're not using immutability, you could just hit save profile and it would continue, and you could send your backups there in an unimmutable state. So we want to enable that, but first we head on over to our bucket within our S3 management console, and you can see here that we match up those settings, those configurations. So we have our region, EU West 2. Then you can also see that bucket versioning can't be suspended because object lock is enabled for this bucket. So when we created the bucket, we came down in our options and we enabled object lock. We used a default retention. We leveraged the compliance retention mode, and we had that retention mode which was default to 21 days. Now we could go in here and we could edit this, and we can change the default retention period as we see fit. That's all we really need to do there. However, from a Kasten K10 point of view, when we enable, we have the ability to validate that this will work. So we query the object storage, the bucket exists, the bucket found in the provided region, the object lock-in API is enabled on that bucket, it has a default retention config applied, and that default retention mode is compliant and 21 days. So we're just validating there that everything that we're doing in the Amazon management console is also the same capability in bucket with the immutability functionality enabled. And that's one thing. Like, obviously that shows simplicity of how easy we can start creating policies and send them to our S3 bucket. However, about another demo that we should be running is actually, let's show a real life working example. So I've got an application that's running in our Kubernetes cluster. I have my data stored in a PVC, so a persistent volume claim, which is from MySQL. And we've been backing that up, your app, frequently to the export that we just created through that UI, where obviously the bucket with object lock-in is enabled. So that's the first part of the demo that kind of tees it up as to this is what we've got. And this will look the same across many different Kubernetes clusters. But however, what we want to do is actually simulate a failure scenario. So the attacker has compromised your Kubernetes cluster and your S3 credentials. So that's quite important. It means that someone has infiltrated into your network. They've managed to get access to your Kubernetes cluster, but also your S3 credentials, potentially your whole cloud credentials. Let's just take it as this example that they didn't get the whole cloud credentials and we were very good from a best practice point of view, and we only had IAM roles set up for S3 that they gained access to. So the attacker compromises and encrypts our database, which is what we're going to see in the demo. And then the attacker deletes your exported Kasten K10 restore points in S3. Now, don't worry, is that we're obviously going to show you how that hasn't affected our recovery options. But the important thing to take away from this next demo is that if we were doing this or wanting to try to do this from a bucket that didn't have object lock-in, where a customer had been compromised from a Kubernetes cluster point of view and their S3 credentials were taken, then that data has been lost. Unless you had another copy of that data somewhere else, that would have been lost. However, because we are using the object lock enabled bucket, it means that, well, we should be in a good spot. So if we take a look, I had a policy, and if we dive in quickly here into our app, so what I'm doing here is I'm quickly going to show you the contents of my database, which is full of some important financial information, mission critical information. If we go and look into AWS and our object storage, you can see here that I have a K10 bucket or a K10 folder, which is where our backups have been going regularly into that bucket. Now, if I run these to simulate, now if I was to put a hoodie on and a black cap, then I would be in here and I would be encrypting my database data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and do the same from a bucket attack point of view. So at this point, if we go in here, we refresh that. Oh no, our K10 folder is now gone. And if we didn't have object lock-in enabled, then we would have a problem here because we wouldn't have access to that. However, we go back to our restore, and you can see here, the green ones that you see on screen are actually the exports out to object storage. They're the versions that we're sending. And I've hit restore on that. The other ones that we have are local snapshots. So we could, in theory, we could have restored back from a localized EBS snapshot from that point if it was running in AWS EKS, for example. So now what we're doing is we're performing a full recovery here. So you'll see the recovery process all kicking in. This takes a couple of minutes and this is in real time. So it's going to take some time to bring back that data from our object storage into whatever that cluster is, regardless of the location. The blocks of data still need to come back. So we're going to give that some time. If you just saw the kubectl command that I just did, that was basically, it showed us that we had the restore pod that was coming up, and that was going to then start streaming the data back into our Kubernetes cluster so that we could start that restore process. So the key part here is that, yes, we're using AWS S3, and S3 compatible is also available. Like if the object lock API is enabled, we can leverage that. So they're the real two use cases here. Again, I just flipped over to the kubectl to show the containers being created and used. But what's going to happen here is, so we're restoring the whole application. We're not just recovering the PVC. We're actually recovering the whole application. So the front end, the client, the application, plus the database, all from our object storage. So that's why it's taken a bit of time. So when that comes back, we're going to be able to log back in like we did at the very beginning of the demo, and we're going to be able to show what that looks like.
Yeah, this is really cool, Michael. Thank you for showing us this recovery. I mean, that's the most important part. I mean, we can protect our data, but can we get it back? And that's what you're demonstrating here.
So yeah, this is streaming that data from object storage back into our Kubernetes environment. And then if we then go back into our AWS bucket and hit refresh, you'll see is that we saw it empty. You saw the K10 folder gone. But because of what we've done, the next time that runs a backup, then the new version will be restored to that. But because we have all of the restored, basically snapshots of each of the exports that we've pushed out into.
And maybe this is a good time to answer this question from Edward out there in the audience.
That gives us that functionality to be able to always restore from that immutable object storage. So here we go. You can see MySQL store in a almost running state. So a couple more seconds, I think it is. And it's really not that much data. You can see from the top card and the right-hand side that we've only pushed 1.1 gig of data into our object storage. You can see that I've got 2 policies in the middle, and we're protecting five applications, and we're only playing with one at the moment, one of those applications. So I think any second now we should be back in business, and we should be able to jump back in to our MySQL client.
Edward is asking, can you protect application state and configuration data? Is that what this is doing?
The other thing to mention here is that, so as much as we've used the Kasten K10 UI to be able to do this, you'll see under the kubectl, there is a small command line CLI script or a kubectl bit of code. And this is because everything that Kasten K10 has the ability to interact with the Kubernetes API. So as much as everyone likes a UI, but obviously from an automation point of view, we might want to automate this task. So what we could do, and what we do, is leave these breadcrumbs around the UI so that we can incorporate that into our automation. You saw that just went 1 from 1. We run the same code again now, and hopefully we see a long list of all of our financial data again. So now we've got that, I'm just going to wrap things up from a resources point of view. So hopefully that was useful. I find it always easy to show a demonstration of what it is that we're actually talking about. But then also, if you want to go and find out more, obviously we have a couple of resources around that. Kasten K10 itself can be deployed and used. But then also we have our learning platform, and our learning platform gives you the ability to like uplift your own skills. And it's not just Kasten K10 focused. In fact, not at all. The first lab is actually deploying your very first Kubernetes cluster in an isolated environment. And then we move through that. There's badges to get and stuff like that. So yeah. So yeah, now David, I guess over to you if there's any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do have some great questions coming in.
Yeah. So the first question is, do you take care of application state and configuration data in your backup solution? The answer is yes, if you want to. So obviously a lot of what we're doing from a K10 perspective is focused on data services. So we have the ability to dive into that application, into that database, and we can use tooling blueprints to be able to. Okay. So yes, the answer is yes. We do look after the application state and the configuration data. So interesting question around, does the Kasten Veeam solution provide any protection against data exfiltration and subsequent extortion by ransomware? So today it's very much a remediation aspect as to how you provide the backup. Like we're not going to enforce you to take any backups. You've got the freedom of choice to do whatever you need to do. In terms of detection and around other areas, we're looking into where else we can help and assist our customer base around that. There's another question. What's the key differentiator of Veeam's solution over that of other vendors who seem to have similar solutions? I think the biggest thing there is that we're software defined. So the majority of our competition, if you will, are they may not need an element of storage, but they're a storage company. So I'd be very wary of like how and when their product leverages that storage or requires that storage for certain licenses within their portfolio. I think that's a good politically correct way of putting that. Any limitation in number of clusters that the recovery can be applied? No, actually, we're looking at this as well, because there's more and more people moving towards edge Kubernetes clusters. So we're looking at that a bigger limitation as to, or extending what it is today. But yeah, we haven't reached that limit yet. And then there's a lot of hellos from everywhere. Awesome. Hope everyone was able to hear everything and see the demos and see the slides. I think, there's one more question. For a team with limited bandwidth, staff or resources, is there a one or two big difference making steps you'd recommend taking forward protecting Kubernetes data? Ultimately, I think you've probably got enough on your plate to learn in Kubernetes and the constructs behind that. So I would definitely want to hit that easy button in terms of protecting that workload. Obviously, I'm going to say Kasten K10, but really it's just about, let's make sure that you're protecting that workload. Now, Kasten K10 has a free edition, up to 10 worker nodes. So literally 10 worker nodes is the size of many different customers out there. And that's before you have to pay any money. So I would suggest that that's a good place to start. Hopefully that helps as well. David, I think that's it for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate your excellent presentation and the really cool demos showing us how to recover from ransomware using Kasten K10. I want to point out to everyone, I just brought up the 2 QR codes that are on the screen. One is for the learning platform, which is a free Kubernetes training solution. You can go check it out.
I'm now reading through the questions where we asked about ransomware.
Okay. It's a great way to learn about Kubernetes there. Make sure that you check that out. Also check out the Kasten K10 platform. There's links to both of those there in the handouts tab. And you can either use the QR code or you can use the link in the handouts tab. So thank you to everyone who joined us. I do want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. This is going to Ben Hainman from Kentucky. Congratulations, Ben Hainman from Kentucky. We'll reach out to you and also to our best question prize winner. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Michael, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Have a great day.